This 1865 photo seemed ordinary, but a small detail revealed a dark secret. The Massachusetts Historical Society received the daguerreotype in a plain manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a note written in shaky handwriting. "This belonged to my grandmother. She said it was important, but never explained why. I'm 93 now and have no children. Someone should know the truth. Dr. Michael Torres, the Society's curator of Civil War photography, carefully removed the daguerreotype from its protective case. The image showed a typical family portrait from 1865. A father in a dark suit, a mother seated in a Victorian dress, and 3 children arranged formally around them. Michael had examined thousands of Civil War-era photographs. This one seemed unremarkable, another prosperous northern family documenting their existence in the final months of the war. The family was posed in front of their home, a brick house with columns. Trees framed the edges, their branches creating natural shadows. The father appeared mid-40s, stern-faced. The mother sat with perfect posture. Their daughter, perhaps 14, stood with the serious expression common in period portraits. 2 younger boys, maybe 6 and 8, stood rigidly beside their father. Michael placed the daguerreotype under his magnifying lamp. Then he noticed something that made him adjust the angle. In the shadows beneath the trees, barely visible, were 2 more figures. The image quality was poor in that section. The figures were out of focus, ghost-like in the dim light. But they were definitely there. Michael increased the magnification. As he studied the shadowed area, the figures became clearer. 2 people stood close together in the darkness. One appeared to be a young man, tall, slender, perhaps 18 or 20. The other was a young woman, her dress simpler than the mother's gown. And they were embracing. Their faces were close together in what appeared to be a kiss. Michael sat back, his heart racing. The photographer would have seen these figures, would have known they were being captured. Unless the couple hadn't realized the photograph was being taken at that moment, unless they thought themselves hidden, safe from observation. Michael examined the visible family again. 5 people were accounted for. But many families in 1865 had older children who had gone to war or married. The shadowed couple intrigued him. The young man's posture suggested wealth. The young woman's dress was plainer, her bearing different from the mother's formality. A romantic relationship captured accidentally. But who were they, and why had this daguerreotype been preserved for over 150 years, with the cryptic note about truth? Michael needed to identify this family. Then he could understand what secret had been hidden for more than a century. Michael spent 2 days examining every detail for identification clues. The house was substantial. Brick with white columns, typical of prosperous northern families. The father's clothing suggested wealth. Tailored suit, visible watch chain, polished shoes. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Michael noticed the daughter held something in her lap, a small book with distinctive binding. He increased magnification and could just make out decorative elements on the cover. It was a Bible, embossed in gold lettering with a name, Whitmore. Michael immediately searched historical records for families named Whitmore in Massachusetts during the Civil War. The search returned dozens of results, but he narrowed it by looking for families wealthy enough to commission professional daguerreotypes and own substantial homes. After 6 hours, he found them, the Whitmore family of Concord, Massachusetts. Samuel Whitmore, born 1820, was a successful textile merchant who supplied uniforms to the Union Army. He married Margaret in 1848. They had 5 children, Thomas, Elizabeth, Henry, and twins, Robert and James. 5 children. But only 3 appeared in the photograph, Elizabeth and the twins. The 2 older sons were absent. Michael searched military records. Thomas Whitmore had enlisted in 1863 at 16, lying about his age. He was killed at Cold Harbor in June 1864. That left Henry unaccounted for, 18 years old in 1865. Michael looked at the shadowed figure again. An 18-year-old young man, home during the final months of war, embracing a young woman while his family posed for a portrait. But who was she? Michael discovered Samuel Whitmore had been an outspoken abolitionist, supporting Frederick Douglass and contributing to anti-slavery societies. The Whitmore home had been a documented underground railroad stop in the 1850s. A newspaper article from 1862 described the Whitmore family's continued charitable work on behalf of the contraband, escaped slaves who fled to Union lines. In 1863, another article noted the Whitmore family had taken in several contraband to assist with household duties, providing them wages and education. Michael found a church registry from 1863. The Whitmore family has registered 3 contraband for baptism: Grace, age 19, Daniel, age 14, and Ruth, age 17. Ruth. 17 in 1863 would make her 19 in 1865, the right age for the young woman in the photograph. Michael located an 1864 census listing the Whitmore household: Samuel, Margaret, 4 surviving children, and 3 servants, Grace, Daniel, and Ruth, all listed as colored and formerly enslaved. Henry Whitmore and Ruth. An 18-year-old son of abolitionists and a 19-year-old formerly enslaved woman kissing in the shadows while his family posed formally. Michael's pulse quickened. This was more than a hidden romance. This was a relationship that crossed every social boundary of 1865 America. He needed to understand what had happened to them and why this photograph had been preserved with such secrecy. Michael drove to Concord the next morning, determined to find the Whitmore house. Using the daguerreotype and historical maps, he located the property. A brick house on the town's outskirts, now divided into apartments, but still recognizable. The property owner, Patricia, was a retired history teacher who immediately invited Michael to examine boxes stored in the attic from previous owners. In a wooden trunk labeled Whitmore Family Papers, Michael found Margaret Whitmore's diary. Her 1863 entries described the arrival of 3 formerly enslaved people. Today, we welcomed Grace, Daniel, and Ruth. They arrived exhausted from their escape from Virginia. Ruth is particularly intelligent. She can already read, which is remarkable. Grace says Ruth's former master's wife taught her in secret. Michael read entries documenting daily household life, Margaret teaching Ruth advanced reading and mathematics, Grace's cooking skills, Daniel's carpentry apprenticeship. Then, in April 1864, the tone shifted. I'm concerned about Henry and Ruth. They spend considerable time together, and I fear my son's affections may lead him toward an unwise attachment. I spoke to Samuel, but he says we must trust Henry's judgment and Ruth's dignity. He reminds me we fought for their freedom. We cannot then deny them freedom to form attachments. But I worry about complications. Michael's hands trembled. Margaret had known about their relationship and had concerns, not from prejudice, but from practical worries about social complications. More entries tracked the developing relationship. Henry asked permission to court Ruth formally. Samuel granted it, with the condition that Ruth's consent be freely given and she understands she's under no obligation. Ruth confirmed she returns Henry's affections. They are young and idealistic, believing love can overcome obstacles. I pray they are right, but I fear the world will be cruel. In September 1864, Henry has asked Ruth to marry him. She accepted. Samuel and I discussed this extensively. We cannot legally prevent the marriage. Massachusetts allows it, though few approve. We decided to support them, though it means social ostracism. Henry is prepared. Ruth is frightened, but resolute. They plan to marry in spring 1865, after the war ends. Michael sat back, understanding dawning. The daguerreotype had been taken in 1865, probably spring. The kiss wasn't stolen or forbidden. It was between an engaged couple, perhaps newlyweds. But if they had family support and legal permission, why hide in shadows during the family portrait? Michael found the answer in Margaret's May 1865 entry. Today, we had our family portrait taken. Henry and Ruth were married last month in a small ceremony. Samuel wanted them included as husband and wife, but Ruth refused. She said she wouldn't subject Henry's family to judgment from openly acknowledging their marriage in a photograph. She said she and Henry would stand in the background, where they could be together, but not visible enough to cause scandal. My heart broke at her consideration for our reputation, even as it meant hiding her rightful place in our family. Michael looked at the daguerreotype with a new understanding. Ruth hadn't been hiding in shame. She had been protecting Henry's family while still claiming her moment with her husband. But what happened afterward? Michael found his answer in Margaret's final 1865 diary pages, and it was heartbreaking. Margaret's diary entries from June 1865 documented increasing tension following Henry and Ruth's marriage. Michael read with growing dread as the situation deteriorated. June 15th, 1865. The minister asked us not to bring Ruth to services. He says her presence causes discomfort. Samuel was furious and said we'd find a new church. But Henry and Ruth insist they don't want to cause division. They've begun attending the African Methodist Episcopal Church instead. June 28th, 1865. Samuel's business partners expressed concerns about the marriage. 2 ended their partnerships, citing moral disagreements. Samuel maintains anyone who cannot accept his son's wife isn't worth doing business with, but I see the financial strain. July 10th, 1865. Someone threw rocks through our windows last night. A note called us race traitors and warned that mixing brings only suffering. The constable says he cannot identify who did it. Henry wants to take Ruth and leave Concord, but Samuel insists we won't be driven from our home by bigotry. Michael felt sick reading the escalating violence. Even in Massachusetts, even after the war for freedom, the reality was harsh. The July 25th entry was the turning point. Henry and Ruth decided to leave. They plan to go to Canada, where other mixed couples have found more acceptance. My heart is breaking. Ruth is 3 months pregnant. She confided this yesterday, and they want their child born somewhere safer. Samuel is helping them arrange passage and providing funds. Michael searched frantically through remaining entries. August 3rd, 1865. Henry and Ruth left this morning before dawn. We said goodbyes in tears, not knowing if we'll ever see them again. Ruth embraced me and thanked me for accepting her. I told her she was my daughter now. Henry promised to write once settled. Entries after were desperate. September. No word from Henry and Ruth. Samuel has made inquiries, but no one knows where they went. October. Still no word. I'm terrified something happened. November. A letter arrived today, but it brought no comfort. Margaret had tucked the actual letter into the diary. Michael unfolded it carefully. It was from a minister in Buffalo, New York, dated October 15th, 1865. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, it is with profound sorrow I inform you of a tragedy. Your son Henry and his wife Ruth stopped in Buffalo on their journey to Canada. On September 20th, a fire broke out in their boarding house. Henry's body was recovered. He perished from smoke inhalation. Ruth survived but went into premature labor from shock. She delivered a daughter but died within hours from complications. The infant survived and is healthy. Before Ruth passed, she asked the child be named Margaret, after you. Please advise how to proceed regarding the infant. Michael sat motionless. Henry and Ruth had died within hours of each other, leaving behind a newborn daughter. Margaret's response, November 10th, 1865. Samuel and I leave for Buffalo tomorrow to bring our granddaughter home. She is all we have left of Henry and Ruth. The town will judge us for raising a colored child, but I don't care. Margaret Ruth Whitmore is our family, and we won't abandon her. Michael spent hours searching through remaining Whitmore papers. He found a baptismal record from December 1865 for Margaret Ruth Whitmore, listing Samuel and Margaret as guardians. Census records from 1870 listed Margaret Ruth in the household. School records documented difficulty enrolling a black child in Concord schools, letters from Margaret fighting for her granddaughter's education, and finally, in 1875, a letter from a Boston school agreeing to admit Margaret Ruth. The last document was Margaret Ruth's marriage license from 1885 at age 20. She had married Thomas Bradley, a teacher in Boston. The witnesses were Samuel and Margaret Whitmore. Michael realized the anonymous donor who sent the daguerreotype must have been a descendant of Margaret Ruth, someone who knew fragments of the story but not the full truth. He published a notice in genealogy forms seeking descendants of Margaret Ruth Whitmore Bradley. Within a week, he received an email from Judith Williams in Vermont. I believe I'm who you're looking for. My great-grandmother was Margaret Ruth Bradley. She died when I was 5, but I remember her telling me stories about being raised by white grandparents in Massachusetts. She said there was a photograph somewhere that explained everything. Is that what you found? Michael called Judith immediately and arranged to meet her in Concord. Judith was 72, a retired schoolteacher with gray hair and intelligent eyes that reminded Michael of Ruth from the daguerreotype. I knew my family history was complicated, Judith said as Michael spread documents across the library table. My great-grandmother told me her parents died when she was a baby, and her white grandparents raised her, but she never told me details, how they died or why they were together. Michael showed her the daguerreotype first, pointing out the shadowed figures. That's your great-great-grandparents, Henry Whitmore and Ruth. They were married in May 1865, just weeks before this photograph. Judith stared at the image, tears forming. I've never seen a picture of them, never knew what they looked like. Michael walked her through everything. Margaret's diaries, the letters about the fire, Margaret Ruth's upbringing, and finally the marriage license from 1885. Your great-grandmother grew up in a white household in Concord at a time when that was almost unheard of, Michael explained. Samuel and Margaret Whitmore fought for her education, her rights, her future. They honored Ruth's dying wish and raised Margaret Ruth as their own granddaughter. Judith wiped her eyes. My great-grandmother used to say her grandparents were remarkable people. She said they taught her that love was stronger than prejudice and family was about choice, not just blood. But did she talk about the relationship between Henry and Ruth? Michael asked carefully. She said her mother had been enslaved and escaped to Massachusetts, where she worked for the Whitmore family. She said her father fell in love with her mother and married her despite everyone telling him not to. She said it was real love, not exploitation. Judith met Michael's eyes. She wanted me to know her parents' marriage was different, that Ruth had freedom and choice. Michael showed her Margaret's diary entries, documenting Ruth's consent and the family's efforts to ensure equality. It wasn't perfect, Judith said quietly. Even with good intentions, power dynamics were complicated, but it was better than most. And Ruth chose Henry, knowing it would be hard. That matters. While cataloging materials for a permanent archive, Michael discovered something he had initially overlooked, a small leather journal dated 1895 to 1920. It belonged to Margaret Ruth. Michael brought it to Judith before reading it. I found your great-grandmother's diary. I thought you should be here when we look at it. They sat together and carefully opened the journal. Margaret Ruth's handwriting was precise and elegant. The first entry, January 1st, 1895, when Margaret Ruth was 29. I begin this journal as I begin my 30th year, finally ready to write about the ghosts that have haunted my life. I have lived as Margaret Ruth Whitmore, raised by white grandparents in a white household, navigating a world that never knew what to make of me. I was too black for white society, too white raised for black society. But I have made peace with this in-between existence because it came from love. Judith's hands trembled as they read. Margaret Ruth had written extensively about growing up in the Whitmore household, about the kindness and occasional awkwardness, about questions she asked and the loving answers her grandparents gave. Grandma Margaret told me about my mother today, an entry from 1870 read. Margaret Ruth would have been 5. She said my mother's name was Ruth, and she was the bravest person Grandma ever knew. She said my mother escaped from slavery. She said my father, Henry, loved my mother so much he married her, even though some people thought he shouldn't. She said they both died in a fire when I was very small, but before my mother died, she named me after Grandma because Grandma was kind to her. I wish I could have known my mother. Michael and Judith read entries documenting Margaret Ruth's growing understanding of her parents' story. Samuel and Margaret had been honest with her, age-appropriately sharing the truth. An entry from 1885 when she married. Today I became a wife, as my mother did 20 years ago. I wonder if she was as nervous, as excited, as hopeful. I wonder if she knew they would have so little time together. Would she have made the same choice if she had known? I think she would have. Love that exists in the face of opposition is perhaps the truest kind. From 1890, when her first child was born, I held my daughter Ruth, named for the grandmother she'll never meet, and understood something profound. I am both black and white, born of love between worlds. My daughter is black, born into a black family, but carrying the legacy of white grandparents who loved her grandmother. Identity is more complicated than society wants it to be. We contain multitudes. Throughout the journal, Margaret Ruth documented her work as a teacher in Boston, her efforts to provide education for black children, her determination to honor both sides of her heritage. One 1910 entry particularly moved Michael. A student asked why I became a teacher. I told her it was because my mother, though enslaved, learned to read in secret. My grandmother, my mother's mother, had been denied education her entire life. But my grandfather Samuel and grandmother Margaret insisted I receive the best education possible. I teach because 3 generations of women fought for the right to learn. I teach to honor them. Near the journal's end, in 1918, Margaret Ruth wrote about seeing the photograph. Today my cousin brought me the family daguerreotype from 1865. I had never seen it. And there, in the shadows beneath trees, I saw them. My father and mother embracing, stealing a moment of joy before tragedy. I stared for an hour, trying to memorize their faces. They looked happy. Like 2 people in love, like 2 people who believed love could overcome anything. I will keep this photograph safe. Someday someone will ask about them, and this image will be proof they existed, that they loved each other, that they created me. 3 months after completing his research, Michael stood in the Massachusetts Historical Society's gallery preparing for an exhibition titled In the Shadows, Hidden Stories of the Civil War Era. The centerpiece was the Whitmore family daguerreotype, now professionally conserved and displayed with a magnified section showing Henry and Ruth's embrace clearly. Beside it, Michael had arranged Margaret Whitmore's diaries, Samuel's letters, Ruth's death record, Henry's death record, and photographs of Margaret Ruth as an adult. But the exhibition included more than the Whitmore story. Michael's research had uncovered dozens of similar stories, interracial couples from the Civil War era whose relationships were documented in fragments, hidden in shadows, preserved in whispers. He had found photographs where careful examination revealed black and white family members posed together in ways suggesting relationships beyond employer and servant. He had found letters documenting marriages that couldn't be legally recognized. He had found birth records listing white fathers who couldn't publicly claim their children. Each story was different. Some were consensual relationships between equals who loved despite social prohibition. Others reflected complicated power dynamics that made true consent questionable. Michael presented these stories with honesty, acknowledging both genuine love and the exploitation that was far more common. But the Whitmore story remained the centerpiece because it illustrated something important. Even with family support, legal marriage, and financial resources, interracial couples faced incredible obstacles. Henry and Ruth had everything working in their favor, and they still died trying to find safety. Judith attended the opening, bringing her children and grandchildren. They stood together looking at the daguerreotype, seeing their ancestors for the first time. "This is where we come from," Judith told her family. "This is the love that created us. It wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect, but it was real." A young black woman approached Michael during the opening. "I have been researching my family history. I found a photograph from 1870 that might be similar to this. There's someone in the background I never noticed before. Could you look at it?" Michael agreed, and over the following months, similar requests came in. People with old photographs they had never examined closely, people with family stories they had never fully understood, people searching for ancestors who had been deliberately hidden. Each photograph Michael examined revealed more stories. Some were interracial romances. Others were family members who had passed as white, or black families who had hidden mixed ancestry, or white families who had raised black children to protect them. The exhibition grew, and with it, a fuller picture emerged, one where the neat categories of race, family, and social order were far more complicated than history books acknowledged. 6 months after opening, Michael received a letter from a Virginia Historical Society. They had been inspired by his work and had begun examining their collections more carefully. They had found several images with similar hidden figures, people literally standing in shadows, documented but not acknowledged. "You've started something important," the letter said. "You've shown us that history isn't just in the obvious subjects of photographs, but in the margins, in the shadows, in the people who weren't supposed to be seen." Michael pinned the letter beside the Whitmore daguerreotype. He thought about Ruth, who had chosen to stand in shadows to protect Henry's family, never knowing that her act would eventually lead to her story being told in full. She had trusted that someday someone would look closely enough to see her. And finally, someone had. 2 years after the exhibition opened, Michael received an unexpected email from David Whitmore in Oregon. "I believe I'm descended from Elizabeth Whitmore, the daughter in the daguerreotype. I heard about your research and wondered if there might be a connection." Michael called David immediately and learned he was indeed descended from Elizabeth, who had married and moved to Oregon in the 1870s. David had grown up knowing an ancestor named Henry died young, but had never heard about Ruth or Margaret Ruth. "My family's version was that Henry died in a tragic fire, and that was the end. No one mentioned a wife or child. I think later generations were ashamed and tried to erase that part of our history." Michael connected David with Judith, and they arranged to meet in Concord. The first time descendants from different Whitmore branches had come together in over a century. The meeting was emotional. David was white, descended from Elizabeth's line. Judith was black, descended from Henry's line. But they were cousins, separated by 5 generations. "This is extraordinary," David said, looking at the daguerreotype with Judith. "Your great-great-grandmother stood in shadows to protect my great-great-great-grandmother Elizabeth and the rest of the family. And now here we are, meeting for the first time." Judith smiled. "Ruth would probably be happy to know the family is reconnecting. From what I've learned, she cared deeply about family unity, even when it cost her personally." They spent the day sharing family stories and photographs. David had pictures of Elizabeth's descendants, the line that stayed in the formal portrait, visible and acknowledged. Judith had pictures of Margaret Ruth's descendants, the line that started in shadows but emerged into proud visibility. "Looking at these side by side," David observed, "the family resemblance is clear. We all have the same eyes, Samuel Whitmore's eyes." Michael photographed them together standing in front of the daguerreotype. The image showed a white man and a black woman, cousins, standing together in 2022, connected by ancestors who had loved across racial lines in 1865. "This is what Henry and Ruth wanted," Judith said softly. "A family that could stand together without hiding, without shame, without fear. It took 160 years, but we're finally here." David nodded. "And we're here because Ruth chose to be in that photograph, even in the shadows. Without that image, I would never have known about Margaret Ruth. I would never have known I had black cousins." Over the next year, more Whitmore descendants came forward. Michael organized a family reunion in Concord in 2023, bringing together over 50 descendants from multiple branches. The reunion took place at the Historical Society, with the daguerreotype displayed prominently. Descendants who had never known about the interracial branch met cousins they hadn't known existed. A genealogist created a comprehensive family tree showing how all branches connected back to Samuel and Margaret. The tree showed Elizabeth's descendants spreading across the western United States, the twins' descendants remaining in New England, and Margaret Ruth's descendants building lives in Boston, New York, and beyond. Judith gave a brief speech, standing beside David. "My great-great-grandparents, Henry and Ruth, loved each other despite knowing it would be difficult. They married anyway. They created a family anyway. And when they died, Samuel and Margaret honored that love by raising my great-grandmother. Today, we stand together, black and white descendants of the same family, because our ancestors believed love was stronger than prejudice." The reunion concluded with everyone gathering outside for a group photograph, over 50 Whitmore descendants standing together, spanning the full spectrum of racial identity. Michael took the photograph and later displayed it beside the 1865 daguerreotype. The contrast was striking, the original showing a family with some members hidden, and the modern image showing all descendants standing together in full sunlight, visible and acknowledged. 5 years after discovering the daguerreotype, Michael stood in his office, surrounded by hundreds of photographs submitted by families across the country. Each image contained its own shadow family, people who had been literally or figuratively hidden, but whose stories were now being told. The Whitmore daguerreotype remained the centerpiece, but it had become something more, a symbol of all families who had loved to cross racial lines during America's most divided eras. Judith had become a collaborator, traveling to speak at museums and universities. At 78, she was determined to ensure Ruth and Henry's love was remembered as courage, not scandal. People ask if I'm angry about how my great-great-grandparents were treated, Judith said during one presentation. Yes, I'm angry they couldn't live openly, that they died trying to find safety, that their daughter grew up without them. But I'm also grateful they loved each other, despite obstacles. Grateful that Samuel and Margaret honored that love. Grateful the photograph exists, because this image proves families like mine existed. We weren't just footnotes, we were real, and we mattered. The exhibition had evolved into a permanent installation called Visible in the Shadows, Hidden Families of American History. It included over 200 photographs spanning the 1840s through 1920s, each showing families that had been documented but not fully acknowledged. Michael had created an online database where people could submit their own family photographs and stories. The database grew daily, with submissions from descendants of Native American and white families, Asian and black families, and countless combinations that defied rigid racial categories. One submission particularly moved Michael, a photograph from 1890 showing a family reunion with over 30 people, spanning multiple generations and obviously representing several racial backgrounds. The submitter explained, "My family has always known we were mixed, but no one talked about details. This photograph was kept in a locked box for over a century. My grandmother finally showed it to me before she died and said, 'Tell the truth. We don't have to hide anymore.'" So here's our truth. We're black, white, native, and probably more. We're American in the most complicated and beautiful sense. Michael included this with the family's permission, adding to the growing archive of families who refused to be erased. The research had also impacted how museums approached their collections. Curators now routinely examined photographs for shadow figures, and exhibition designers made deliberate efforts to include interracial family stories. One major outcome was a change in how genealogical records were interpreted. Historians began developing new methodologies for tracing families whose connections weren't documented traditionally, looking at property transfers, trust funds, baptismal records, and other indirect evidence of relationships that couldn't be legally recognized. On the 10th anniversary of discovering the daguerreotype, Michael organized a symposium on hidden families in American photography. IUM's researchers presented findings from across the country, showing how careful visual analysis could reveal families and relationships that written records obscured. Judith gave the keynote address, now 83 but still eloquent. 10 years ago, my mother sent a photograph to this institution with a simple note. Someone should know the truth. She didn't know what would come of it. She just knew the story mattered. And she was right. This one photograph opened the door to thousands of other stories. It taught us to look more carefully and to honor the love that existed despite everything. She paused, looking at the projected daguerreotype. Ruth stood in shadows to protect Henry's family, but she insisted on being in the photograph. She claimed her place, however small, and 160 years later, we finally see her. The symposium concluded with participants gathering for a group photograph. Over 200 historians, curators, genealogists, and descendants of shadow families standing together in acknowledgement that these stories were now part of the official historical record. Michael thought about the small detail that had started everything. Two figures barely visible in shadows, embracing in a moment of stolen joy. He thought about how easily that detail could have been overlooked, how the photograph could have been cataloged as simply Whitmore family, 1865, without anyone noticing the people in the background. But someone had noticed, someone had looked carefully, and that careful attention had revealed not just one family's story, but an entire hidden history of families who had loved across racial lines during America's most divided eras. The daguerreotype remained on display at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Michael had added a new placard. Henry Whitmore and Ruth, married May 1865, photographed in shadows to protect family from social consequences. They died together, September 1865, leaving behind a daughter who carried their legacy forward. This image preserves their love and proves that families like theirs existed, mattered, and deserved to be remembered. Here below the image, a quote from Margaret Ruth's journal. "They stood in shadows so their love could survive. We stand in light to honor them." Michael's research had been compiled into a book titled Shadow Families, Interracial Kinship in Post-Civil War America. The book used photographs as primary sources, arguing that careful visual analysis could reveal family structures that written records often obscured. Judith had written the foreword. "For generations, families like mine existed in shadows, literally and figuratively. We were erased from official records, excluded from family Bibles, omitted from genealogies. But we existed, we loved, we survived. And photographs like the one of my great-great-grandparents prove it. These images are more than historical curiosities. They are proof of our existence, evidence of families that refuse to be forgotten. The impact extended beyond academic circles. Descendants of shadow families began connecting with each other, creating networks and support groups. Annual gatherings brought together people whose ancestors had loved across racial lines, creating community around shared histories of complexity, courage, and survival. Schools began incorporating these stories into curriculum, teaching students that American families had always been more diverse and complicated than traditional narratives acknowledged. Museum exhibits across the country featured shadow family photographs, challenging visitors to look more carefully at historical images. Michael continued receiving photographs weekly, people discovering hidden figures in their family portraits, people finding evidence of relationships that had been deliberately obscured, people piecing together family stories that previous generations had kept secret. Each photograph added another piece to the puzzle of American family history. Each story revealed the ways people had found to love, protect, and create families despite laws and social conventions that said they couldn't. Ruth's choice to stand in shadows had initially seemed like erasure, hiding herself to protect others, but Michael now understood it as resistance. She had insisted on being in the photograph, on being documented, even if she couldn't stand prominently. She had preserved her existence for anyone who cared enough to look closely. And 160 years later, people were finally looking. Michael locked the exhibition hall that evening, leaving lights on so the daguerreotype remained illuminated. Henry and Ruth, no longer hidden in shadows, finally fully seen, their love acknowledged, their family recognized, their courage honored. The small detail that had revealed the truth, two figures embracing in shadows, had opened a window into an entire hidden history. It had taught historians to look more carefully, had given descendants permission to claim their complicated heritages, and had proven that families built on love could survive even when society tried to erase them. Ruth had stood in shadows to protect the people she loved, but she had also ensured she was documented, preserved, remembered. She had trusted that someday someone would look closely enough to see her. Michael had been that someone, and through his work, millions of others were now seeing her too, seeing Ruth and Henry, seeing Margaret Ruth, seeing Judith and David and all the descendants who carried their legacy forward. The truth Ruth had protected for 160 years was finally known, that love could exist across any boundary, that families could be built despite any obstacle, and that people who stood in shadows deserved to be brought into the light.